On the morning of September 16, 1992, the financial world woke up to what would soon be remembered as Black Wednesday. It was the day when the legendary hedge fund manager George Soros pulled off one of the greatest financial trades in history, breaking the Bank of England and pocketing over $1 billion in a single day. To understand how one man could bring down the British pound and force the UK government into economic turmoil, we need to step back and examine the larger picture, the political and economic landscape of Europe in the early 1990s. At the time, Britain was a member of the European Exchange Rate Mechanism (ERM), a system designed to stabilize exchange rates across Europe in preparation for a single currency, the euro. The ERM was essentially a framework that tied the value of the British pound to the German Deutsche Mark, ensuring that the currency did not fluctuate beyond a set limit. However, this strategy came at a cost. By fixing its exchange rate, Britain was forced to follow Germany's monetary policies regardless of whether they suited its own economy. In the early 1990s, Germany was dealing with the financial consequences of reunification, leading to high interest rates to curb inflation. But Britain's economy was struggling. The country was facing rising unemployment and a recession, and it desperately needed lower interest rates to stimulate growth. Yet, being in the ERM meant the UK had to keep interest rates high to maintain the pound's value within the agreed limits. This mismatch created a major problem, one that George Soros and his team at Quantum Fund were watching closely. George Soros was already a well-known and highly successful investor. His Quantum Fund was among the most powerful hedge funds in the world, known for making bold and aggressive bets on financial markets. Soros had a keen understanding of market psychology and the weaknesses of government policies. By mid-1992, Soros had identified a fatal flaw in Britain's position. The pound was severely overvalued and the British government had no good options. If they continued to defend the currency, they would burn through their foreign currency reserves and damage their economy even further. But if they devalued the pound, it would be a massive political and economic embarrassment. Soros saw an opportunity, a once-in-a-lifetime trade that could yield billions. He started preparing. First, he and his team borrowed billions of pounds from banks and financial institutions, converting them into German marks and other stronger currencies. This was a short-selling strategy, a bet that the pound would fall. If the British government failed to defend the currency, Soros could buy back the pounds at a much lower price and return the borrowed money, keeping the difference as pure profit. The stage was set. All Soros needed was for the pressure to mount on the British government, forcing them to capitulate. And then September 16th arrived. As September 16, 1992 dawned, financial markets across Europe were on high alert. The pressure on the British pound had been building for weeks, and it was becoming clear that the UK government was running out of options. But on this particular morning, something extraordinary happened. George Soros and his Quantum Fund launched their final attack. Soros had already been selling off British pounds in smaller amounts, but on Black Wednesday, he and his fund went all in. His firm started aggressively short-selling the pound in the open market, dumping billions at an unprecedented pace. It wasn't just Soros. Other hedge funds, institutional investors, and traders had also been watching Britain's struggle and saw an opportunity. Like sharks drawn to blood, they began to pile on, betting that the British pound was doomed. The pressure on the Bank of England was immense. The central bank, under orders from the British government, fought back with everything it had. They began buying up pounds using their foreign currency reserves in an effort to maintain the exchange rate. But Soros had calculated this response well. He knew that the Bank of England's reserves were limited, while he and other speculators had almost unlimited firepower in comparison. Every pound that the Bank of England bought to prop up the currency was instantly resold by Soros and others, forcing the government to buy even more, draining its reserves at a terrifying pace. As the crisis deepened, British officials scrambled to find a solution. The government's key figures, Prime Minister John Major and Chancellor of the Exchequer Norman Lamont, were watching in horror as the pound continued its freefall. By mid-morning, the Bank of England had already spent billions of pounds trying to defend the currency, but the pressure was relentless. The government was faced with two painful choices. Raise interest rates dramatically to make the pound more attractive to investors. Abandon the ERM and let the pound float freely, which would mean admitting defeat. Hoping to scare off speculators, Chancellor Norman Lamont made a shocking announcement: the UK would raise interest rates from 10% to 12% immediately. The logic was simple: if Britain made borrowing money more expensive, investors might stop betting against the pound. But Soros and other traders didn't flinch. They knew the British economy was already struggling and such a sudden spike in interest rates would only make things worse. So they kept selling. By midday, it was clear the market had called the government's bluff. The pound continued to fall and panic was setting in. Desperate, Lamont announced an even more drastic measure, raising interest rates to 15%. This was an almost unheard-of move meant to shock the markets and force speculators to back off. But instead of stabilizing the currency, the move had the opposite effect. Investors saw it as proof that the UK was on the verge of collapse. They kept short-selling the pound, and within hours, it became clear that Britain was fighting a losing battle. By late afternoon, the unthinkable happened. The British government, exhausted and humiliated, officially announced that it was withdrawing from the ERM. The pound was left to float freely, and almost immediately, it plummeted in value against other currencies. As the dust settled, it became clear just how much money George Soros had made. His quantum fund had successfully shorted the pound, and when Britain was forced to let the currency devalue, he bought it back at a much cheaper rate, making over $1 billion in a single day. The trade cemented his reputation as one of the most brilliant and ruthless investors in history. From that day forward, he would be known as the man who broke the Bank of England. For Britain, the consequences were severe. The government had spent billions trying to defend the currency, only to fail spectacularly. The economy took a massive hit, and John Major's government suffered an enormous loss of credibility. But ironically, the devaluation of the pound eventually helped Britain. With a weaker currency, British exports became cheaper and more competitive, leading to an economic rebound in the years that followed. Black Wednesday was a turning point, not just for Britain, but for global financial markets. It proved that even powerful governments and central banks could be overpowered by market forces. It also solidified the idea that hedge funds and large institutional investors could influence world economies, shaping the way future financial crises would be handled. And as for George Soros, the billionaire investor used his newfound fame to expand his influence, becoming one of the world's most powerful financiers and philanthropists. But for many in Britain, he remained the man who humiliated their government and changed history with a single brilliant financial move. As the sun set on September 16, 1992, the United Kingdom was left reeling from what had just unfolded. The British pound had collapsed, the government had lost billions of pounds in foreign reserves, and a single hedge fund manager had outmaneuvered the Bank of England. But while the immediate damage was obvious, the long-term consequences of Black Wednesday were only beginning to unfold. This wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a moment that would reshape Britain's economy, political landscape, and the way global markets functioned. In the days following Black Wednesday, the British government was in damage control mode. The Conservative Party, which had been in power under Prime Minister John Major, was deeply humiliated. Major had campaigned on the promise that the ERM would bring stability and prosperity to Britain. Instead, it had become a financial disaster. Many in the country began questioning whether the government truly understood how to manage the economy. The public backlash was severe. Norman Lamont, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, became a scapegoat for the disaster. In the House of Commons, opposition leader John Smith mocked him, saying, "Today has been a humiliating day for Britain and a disaster for the government. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor have presided over the greatest humiliation this country has seen since Suez." This reference to the Suez Crisis of 1956, a major political failure for Britain, showed just how devastating Black Wednesday was for the government. Internally, within the Conservative Party, the crisis created deep divisions. Some argued that Britain should never have joined the ERM in the first place. Others believed the government had made a mistake by not devaluing the pound sooner, rather than wasting billions trying to fight the market. But for ordinary Britons, the crisis had real consequences. The government's attempts to defend the pound had kept interest rates painfully high, which hurt homeowners and businesses alike. Many people lost their homes due to skyrocketing mortgage payments, and businesses struggled to borrow money. Unemployment rose, and consumer confidence collapsed. Britain was already in a recession, and Black Wednesday made it worse. Yet, despite the short-term pain, the collapse of the pound ended up helping Britain in the long run. By leaving the ERM, the UK government regained control over its monetary policy. It no longer had to keep interest rates artificially high to defend the currency. Instead, the Bank of England was able to lower interest rates, which eventually helped businesses recover and encouraged economic growth. Additionally, the weaker pound made British exports cheaper and more competitive on the global market. Industries that had been struggling under an overvalued currency suddenly found themselves thriving. Within a few years, Britain's economy had rebounded strongly. Some analysts even argue that leaving the ERM allowed Britain to avoid the economic stagnation that some other European countries experienced in the years that followed. While Britain was dealing with the political and economic aftermath, one man stood at the center of the storm: George Soros. His gamble had paid off spectacularly. His quantum fund had made an estimated $1.5 billion in profits, one of the most successful trades in financial history. Overnight, Soros had become a household name, not just in financial circles but in politics and the media. The British tabloids painted him as a villain, the ruthless speculator who had attacked the pound and humiliated the country. Some even called him an economic terrorist. But among investors, he was hailed as a genius. Soros hadn't created Britain's economic problems. He had merely recognized their inevitability and bet accordingly. In interviews after Black Wednesday, Soros remained calm and analytical. He argued that his actions weren't personal or political. They were simply about making rational financial decisions. Markets are constantly in a state of uncertainty and flux, and money is made by discounting the obvious and betting on the unexpected. This quote reflected his trading philosophy. He understood human psychology, government policies, and market forces better than almost anyone else. However, Black Wednesday also had an unintended consequence for Soros. It made him a target. In the years that followed, conspiracy theories and political attacks would increasingly focus on him, portraying him as a shadowy figure pulling the strings of global finance. For better or worse, Black Wednesday transformed George Soros into one of the most controversial financial figures of modern times. While the biggest effects were felt in Britain, Black Wednesday sent shockwaves through financial markets worldwide. Governments learned a painful lesson. The idea that central banks could control currency values indefinitely was shattered. Even a major world power like the UK couldn't fight against market forces forever. The rise of hedge funds, Soros's victory, inspired a new generation of traders and hedge funds to look for similar opportunities in global markets. Short selling, once seen as a niche strategy, became mainstream. The decline of the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, ERM, Britain's humiliating exit made other European countries nervous about their own participation in the ERM. Eventually, the ERM collapsed entirely, paving the way for a new approach to European monetary policy, the creation of the euro in 1999. But despite these broader implications, the most lasting memory of Black Wednesday remained the stunning defeat of the British government at the hands of financial markets. One man had placed a bet against the system and won. As Britain grappled with the aftermath of Black Wednesday, the event's legacy continued to unfold, shaping economic policies, financial strategies, and even political careers for years to come. The world had just witnessed a historic power shift. Not in politics, but in the financial markets. Governments and central banks had always believed they could control their economies, manipulate exchange rates, and resist outside pressure. But George Soros and the global financial community had proven otherwise. In the weeks and months following September 16, 1992, Britain's economy continued to struggle. The sudden devaluation of the pound led to a financial crisis that hit ordinary citizens hard. Mortgage rates skyrocketed, and thousands of homeowners who had taken out loans at previously low rates found themselves unable to keep up with payments. Many lost their homes. Businesses that had relied on stable currency rates suffered heavy losses, leading to bankruptcies and mass layoffs. The British government, having spent over £3 billion in reserves trying to defend the pound, now faced a massive financial hole. At the same time, Britain's humiliating exit from the ERM weakened its influence in European politics. Other European leaders saw Black Wednesday as a cautionary tale, proving that countries with weak economies should not tie themselves to stronger ones. Politically, Black Wednesday was a disaster for the Conservative Party. The party had been in power since 1979, first under Margaret Thatcher and then under John Major. Before the crisis, the Conservatives had prided themselves on being the party of economic competence. But Black Wednesday shattered that image. The Labour Party, which had been in opposition, seized on the crisis, using it as a key talking point for the next several years. When the 1997 general election came around, Tony Blair and his New Labour movement defeated the Conservatives in a landslide victory. Many analysts argue that the political damage of Black Wednesday was so severe that it played a major role in keeping the Conservatives out of power for 13 years until David Cameron's victory in 2010. While the British government was suffering, George Soros's name was being spoken in financial circles with a mix of awe and fear. He was no longer just a successful investor, he had become a legend, a man who had made $1.5 billion in a single day by predicting what an entire nation's government could not accept, the inevitable collapse of the pound. In financial markets, Soros's success elevated hedge funds to a new level of power and influence. Investors now understood that these funds, with their massive amounts of capital and ability to take aggressive, high-risk positions, had the ability to challenge and even defeat national governments in financial battles. However, outside of the financial world, Soros became a target. Many in Britain viewed him as a villain, someone who had attacked their country's economy for personal gain. British newspapers ran headlines like, "The man who stole $1 billion from Britain." He was accused of profiting off people's misery, with some politicians and media outlets blaming him for the economic hardships that followed. But Soros dismissed these claims, arguing that he was merely playing within the rules of capitalism. In later interviews, he would state, "I was acting as a market participant. It was not me who broke the Bank of England, it was the government's policies that were unsustainable." Regardless of one's view on Soros, there was no denying the impact of his actions. The collapse of the British pound did not just affect Britain, it sent shockwaves throughout the global financial system. Central banks became more cautious. Governments and central banks realized that speculators had the power to challenge them, forcing them to rethink how they managed their currencies. Future currency pegs and monetary policies were designed with greater flexibility, ensuring that governments were not trapped in a losing battle. Hedge funds became global superpowers. The success of Soros's quantum fund showed that hedge funds were not just passive investors, they were powerful market players that could move economies. As a result, more hedge funds emerged, each looking for the next big opportunity to profit from economic instability. The birth of the euro. The failure of the exchange rate mechanism (ERM) ultimately played a role in shaping the decision to create the euro. European leaders realized that a system where currencies were loosely tied together was too vulnerable to attacks. By 1999, the euro was officially introduced as a common currency, replacing multiple national currencies across Europe. Even decades after Black Wednesday, debates continue about whether Soros was a financial genius simply playing the game or an opportunist who caused suffering for millions. Some argue that he exposed the flaws in the British economic system and forced the government to make necessary corrections. Others believe he exploited the system for personal gain, causing real hardship for thousands of people. Soros himself has always defended his actions, saying that he merely recognized reality before others did. "I am blamed for something that would have happened with or without me." But whether one sees him as a visionary or a villain, one thing is certain. Black Wednesday was a turning point in financial history. And George Soros would forever be remembered as the man who broke the Bank of England. As the dust settled after Black Wednesday, the world of finance had changed forever. The event wasn't just a crushing defeat for the British government, it was a historic lesson in the power of financial markets over national economies. For Britain, it was a period of shame and soul-searching. For investors, it was a moment of revelation. And for George Soros, it was the defining event that cemented his status as one of the most powerful and controversial financial figures of modern history. But the impact of September 16, 1992 didn't end with Britain's departure from the exchange rate mechanism (ERM). The consequences rippled across the world, influencing financial strategies, political decisions, and even Soros's own future. In the short term, Black Wednesday was a disaster for the UK. The pound's collapse, the government's financial losses, and rising unemployment created a wave of economic hardship. However, in the long run, Britain actually benefited from leaving the ERM. A stronger economy. Without the ERM's restrictions, interest rates were lowered, making it easier for businesses and homeowners to recover. A weaker pound made British exports more competitive, boosting trade and economic growth. By the late 1990s, Britain's economy had become one of the strongest in Europe, showing that leaving the ERM had, in fact, been the right move. The fall of the Conservative Party. The ruling Conservative Party, which had pushed Britain into the ERM, never fully recovered from the humiliation of Black Wednesday. In 1997, Tony Blair's Labour Party won a historic landslide victory, ushering in a new era of British politics that lasted for over a decade. The rise of financial speculation. Hedge funds and traders, inspired by Soros's success, realized that governments were not invincible. Currency speculation increased globally, leading to similar crises in Asia 1997, Russia 1998, and Argentina 2001. Black Wednesday had proved a fundamental truth: no government, no matter how powerful, could defy market forces forever. After making $1.5 billion in a single day, George Soros was no longer just a wealthy investor, he was a legend. His name became synonymous with currency speculation, and his success made hedge funds even more influential in global finance. But the fame came at a cost. Soros became a target of politicians and conspiracy theorists who blamed him for economic collapses around the world. In Hungary and Russia, he was labeled a financial manipulator and accused of using his wealth to interfere in global politics. In the United States, he became a highly polarizing figure, funding progressive political causes while facing fierce criticism from conservative groups. Despite the controversies, Soros continued to expand his empire both as an investor and a philanthropist. His Open Society foundations have donated billions to causes ranging from education and healthcare to democracy and human rights. But no matter what he did afterward, Black Wednesday remained his defining moment. In a later interview, Soros reflected on the event, saying, "It was one of the most exciting days of my life. Not because of the money, but because we understood something that even governments did not." Even decades later, the lessons of Black Wednesday remain relevant. Markets are more powerful than governments. Governments may try to control their economies, but market forces always win in the end. No currency is invincible. Britain's defeat proved that even major world currencies could be vulnerable to speculation. Speculators will always exist. As long as there is money to be made, traders will always look for weaknesses in financial systems and exploit them. Hedge funds became global superpowers. Before Black Wednesday, governments held the upper hand. Afterward, it became clear that traders like Soros could outmaneuver entire nations. The day George Soros broke the Bank of England was not just a financial event, it was a turning point in economic history. It exposed the flaws in Europe's financial system, shook the foundations of Britain's political establishment, and forever changed the way investors and governments approached global markets. For George Soros, it was the trade of a lifetime. For Britain, it was a day of reckoning. And for the world, it was a lesson in the unstoppable power of free markets. Black Wednesday was a moment when a single man, armed with nothing but financial knowledge and a bold strategy, brought an entire nation to its knees. And it proved once and for all that in the battle between governments and markets always win.